I've got 5 IEMs to share with you this week, and they all range between $170 and $220. Each model here has really strong marketing claims about its value and its benefits, but I wanted to know which one was actually the best. And so I've measured and compared each of these across multiple genres, across multiple source devices, to get a handle on how each one sounds and share that with you so you can make an informed decision. And in the end, I'll tell you how my favourites here compare to a couple of other favourites in the same sort of price range, specifically the 7Hz Timeless and the THEAUdio Elixir. Plus, I'm continuing to build my IEM tier list, so I'm going to be giving you my tier rankings for each of these at the end as well. So there's lots and lots to watch out for and to stick with me through this process. If you're arriving here and you haven't seen the previous video in this series of 5 where I reviewed the Simgot EA1000, you might want to go and check that one out before you watch this one, because I'm going to be comparing the MP145s that I'm talking about here to the EA1000s at the end of this review. There's a link in the description through to that video, so you can check that out first and then come back here once you're all up to speed. If you don't care about the EA1000 and you just want to know my thoughts on the MP145, then let's dive into it. The MP145s here are a $199 plain and magnetic IEM coming from Hidizs, and I want to say a huge thanks to Hidizs for sending these out to me. These use a fairly large 14.5mm planar diaphragm, and that driver has a 30 ohm impedance and 104 decibel sensitivity. Just like the EA1000s that I mentioned earlier, and that I'll compare these to later, these also come with 3 different tuning nozzles, 1 pair fitted and 2 in the box, and Hidizs list them as a vocal, a balanced and a bass tuning filter. So we'll check all those out in the course of this review, but before we get there, let's talk a bit about the design of the MP145. These are a chunky aluminium shell design, and I'd have to say they're not very dainty. Now that might not be a problem, you might not need a dainty IEM, but they're a pretty chunky design and they're fairly long as well. I didn't really find any issues with fit. They fit my ears okay. Mine are just average sized ears in terms of the concha, which is kind of the bowl at the bottom of the ear. But one thing that I would point out is they've got a fairly thick nozzle on them, and also only a very small flange underneath where the tuning nozzle goes on. And that was a bit of a problem for me, not so much for my ears, but for the test rig. Because these come with 3 different sets of tips, you've got a vocal, a balanced and a bass tip, as well as a vocal, balanced and a bass nozzle. With those various tips and their various constructions, I found that some of them wouldn't fit into the test rig ear hole. So be aware, if you've got very small ear canals, these could be a bit tricky and you might have to find very specific tips to get them to fit for you. What it also means is that I can't share with you measurements of the different tips and what they're doing to the sound because I couldn't get accurate readings. And so all of my measurements with all the IEMs in this 5-part series, they're actually all done with what I call my reference tips. Not because they're a particularly good tip, but because they're the one tip that consistently fits well into my test rig, and so I try to use that to make all measurements kind of consistent and able to be compared. While we're talking tips, the one other thing to mention about these that's a little tiny negative is that I also found fitting tips quite challenging on these nozzles. Again, because of the thickness of the nozzle and the very small lip that you've got underneath the tuning filters, I found that it was often challenging to get the tips on, and they'd very easily want to pop off again. Once you get them on really securely, they seem to be fine, but that initial getting them on was a bit fiddly and a bit tricky. Beyond that though, I like everything else about the design of the MP145. The cable that they come with is fine. It's a 2-pin connection like all these in this review. And so everything else is just fine with these. Nothing to complain about with the accessories, the fit. I was able to wear them comfortably for extended periods. I think they're completely fine in that regard. And so that means it all comes down to how they sound and how they compare. As I mentioned in the EA1000 review, all testing was done with the Chord Mojo 2 and the Chord Poly, and I was using Final Audio E-Type tips on all IEMs, so I had a consistent and reliable fit. For this round of testing, one of the tracks I used and the one that I made my notes on was Merci by Corey Wong. Kicking things off with the silver nozzles because that's what was on them at the time, and the MP145 also sounds fantastic. I say also because the EA1000s in the last video, they sounded fantastic too. What the MP145 showed me initially was a good sense of punch, a wonderful sense of space and size in the soundstage with good imaging again. And on this track, there's lots of sounds kind of spread around the soundstage, popping out of space, and the MP145 did a wonderful job with them. I felt like the tonality was also really good. No instruments were overly emphasized or sort of pushed forward in any way. Everything just sounded natural and true to life. I feel like the tonality of the MP145 with this silver tip on at least, or the silver nozzle, I feel like it leans a little bit towards warmth, but it's done really tastefully. It's not overdone, and it maintains a sense of clarity and precision whilst also being very enjoyable due to that bit of warmth that it brings. One thing that's particularly interesting about the MP145 is how it delivers bass. The bass from these is very tactile and solid, but it's also kind of blunted in a way. It's not super fast, but it is fairly well controlled, and yet something about it feels, just as I said, blunt. I can't find a better word for it. It's kind of hard to describe in isolation. I'll try to put it into more context through the comparisons. But for those of you that are familiar with punchy, tight, dynamic driver bass, these just sound a bit different. As I said, it's almost like it sounds to my ears, almost like the driver doesn't quite go through a full extension. It's like it hits a point, pauses, and then comes back again. Now, I'm massively over-exaggerating. That would sound dreadful if that's what it was doing. That's essentially clipping that I've just described. It's not doing that, but there's something unusual about the character of the bass. It's not bad. It's not an issue in any way, but it's different and not what I'm used to necessarily, hearing something like the EA1000 that I talked about in the last video. But we'll get to that more in comparisons. Before we get there, let's keep on with the MP145 and now switching over from the silver nozzles to the red nozzles. Moving over to the red nozzles, and their shift was really interesting. If you look at the graph for this, it looks like the red nozzles should get warmer compared to the silver nozzles. There's less treble, and therefore you'd think it'd be warmer. In actual fact though, what happens is the lift in the mid-range from the red nozzle, that helps to kind of raise the sense of clarity in the sound and stops it from getting any warmer. There is clearly less energy in the treble from the red nozzles. For better or worse, I'll leave that up to you. And I think some people will be kind of troubled or will miss the loss of energy around the 2 to 3 kilohertz mark. It does leave them feeling a little bit too relaxed, a little bit too laid back for my taste, and I know that others will be in the same boat and might want even more than what these have in the standard sort of silver nozzle tuning. I also feel like the red nozzles damp some of the separation, the clarity, the staging, and so whilst the red nozzles were enjoyable for me, the silvers were definitely the choice that I would make out of the two that we tried so far. But we've got one left, so let's now talk about the rose gold nozzles. Moving over to the rose gold nozzles, and immediately that sense of energy that the silver nozzles had, that's come back. So the rose gold and the silver have that energy, the red not so much. The red does get a bit polite. Unfortunately for me, maybe good for you, the rose gold nozzles brought just a bit too much energy in the upper registers. I found they started to border on fatiguing for me, whereas the silvers I think I could listen to all day. The rose golds just got a little bit too energetic in the top end. What they also did was bring the sense of the central image of the vocals, or the mid-range, a little bit more forward, a little bit closer, and made it a bit more forceful. Again, not necessarily in a bad way, some people will prefer it, but for me it made the music less relaxing to listen to, it kind of forced it at me a bit, and I didn't enjoy that so much. And so as you can probably tell at this point, it's the silver nozzles that came out on top for me with the MP145. And with those in place, I think they're a pretty balanced overall sound. From a pure naturality or neutrality point of view, I do think they lean into warmth, but they handle it really well and they balance it really well. And so the question for me now was, would these come out ahead of the Simgot EA1000s? Because I'd really enjoyed the EA1000s already. Sticking with the silver nozzles on the MP145 and sticking with the gold nozzles on the EA1000s as my favourite there, and still listening to Merci by Corey Wong, the first thought that I had when I plugged in the EA1000s was that their extra treble and their slightly leaner sense of bass tuning having less warmth in the sound, my first thought was that it was bringing a sense of greater transparency and space to the sound. At least space between instruments, maybe not overall soundstage space, as we'll get to. The key thing for me was that the EA1000 came across as more transparent at first. My first thought was, I'm hearing things here that I wasn't hearing on the MP145. But it's not actually quite that simple, because as I listened more and more and tried some different tracks, what I found was that the EA1000 had that very flat stage that I mentioned earlier, whereas the MP145 gave me more sense of overall soundstage space by having more depth. It might not have been quite as wide as the Simgot EA1000, but once you added in a good sense of width with a good sense of depth, they started to show me a lot more going on in the depths of the soundstage as well as the width. And so what actually started to happen, and if we jump back now referring to Merci by Corey Wong, those sounds that pop out of the soundstage, they didn't really do that as much on the EA1000s. Because all the sounds were kind of lined up left to right, they still had kind of their emergence into space, but it wasn't as dramatic and they didn't sound as well placed and separated as the MP145 was delivering. Thinking about depth of bass, and I definitely feel like the EA1000 has the edge there over the MP145. These are no slouch, but the EA1000 bass is exceptional in my opinion. And in addition to that extension being better on the EA1000, I feel like the sense of texture and control was also stronger from the EA1000. And that comes back to what I said before, the bass character from the MP145 is a little bit blunted. it doesn't have the same sense of excursion and punch and texture that something like the EA1000 gives you. The MP145 just has a different character to it that's not entirely natural. Having said that, it's not like it's vastly unnatural, it's not like it's really distracting, and I thoroughly enjoyed every minute with the MP145. It was only when I was really critically thinking about its sound that I could hear that it was bringing a sort of character to the bass. Not coloration, it wasn't messing with it, but it definitely had a certain character to it. And so this was a really tough call for me to work out which of these two I would carry forward into my third video in this series. And ultimately for me, the decision actually came down to the spatial performance. I think tonally both are excellent, neither is completely perfect. The EA1000 borders on fatiguing for me, it doesn't quite get there, but it's right on the edge. On the other hand, the MP145 has that slight bluntedness to its bass that if I really focus on, I'm aware of. But the thing that tipped me over the edge was that the spatial representation in the sense of depth and layering and width and general separation, that was all better and it was therefore more immersive for me from the MP145. And so the MP145 was the one that I kept wanting to reach for again, and therefore it's the one that carries through into the next video. And so if you want to see that next video, if you want to see if the MP145 can go all the way through all 5 of these videos for the win, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And for now, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. But for now, let me leave it to the music, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.